Montana Territory, August 1883. The wind carried the scent of dry pine and smoke as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the tired town of Three Pines. On the sagging porch of a weathered farmhouse at the edge of the valley, Margaret Tiller sat still as stone, hands folded in her lap, eyes empty as the dusk. She had not spoken more than a few words in weeks. Not since her husband vanished into the Bitterroots with a bottle and never came back. Not since the neighbors turned their backs. Not since her 2 children Tommy and Tessa were taken from her arms by a judge in Fort Benton who called her unfit. She did not scream. She did not cry. She just sat there, watching the road, like maybe someone would come and put it all right. And then someone did. His horse trotted in slow, steady rhythm, hooves crunching over dry gravel as he rode up the path. Sunlight caught the dust on his coat, and he tipped his hat back when he saw her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like he had known both long rides and long silences. His name was Callum Zade, and he had not been back to Three Pines in 10 years. He dismounted and tied his gelding to the post, boots scuffing the porch as he stepped up. She did not flinch. She barely looked. "Margaret," he said, voice low, like it had not been a decade since he last saw her. "It's me." She blinked slowly. He crouched down in front of her, hat in his hands. "Look at me," he said gently. "I'll fill them again." Her lips parted just slightly. Her eyes moved just a flicker, but they landed on his face. He saw the hurt in them, the hollowness, but he also saw something else. Recognition. "Callum," she whispered. He nodded. She looked away again, swallowing hard. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice rough. "I heard what happened. I was out in Helena working cattle. Word came through the station that you were alone now, that they took the kids. I could not stop them," she said, barely audible. He sat on the porch beside her. "I know. I tried. I tried to get work. I went to the schoolhouse, the mercantile. No one would speak to me. Said I was cursed. You are not cursed. I cannot even get them back." He turned to her. "Then I will." She pulled in a breath, sharp and shaky. "Why would you do that?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the road curled into the trees. "Because I left once. I never should have." Margaret looked down at her hands. "You were just a boy. I was 18. I knew what I was doing. I was scared, but I knew. I left you behind, and I never forgot it." Silence settled between them, thick but not uncomfortable. She moved first, only a little, her arm brushing his sleeve. "I do not know how to be any more," she said. "I will remind you." He said it simply, like it was not a promise he would give his life to keep. The next morning, Callum was already chopping wood when Margaret stepped outside. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she wore the same faded blue dress from the day before. "I made coffee," she said. He looked up. Sweat clung to his neck, and his shirt clung to his back, but he smiled. "That sounds like salvation." Inside, the house was quiet and bare. Most of the furniture was gone, sold off to keep the land. But the stove still worked, and the coffee was hot. She poured him a cup and slid it across the table. "I do not have sugar. I do not need it." They sat across from each other, steam rising between them. She studied his hands, the way they wrapped around the tin mug. She remembered those hands, how they used to steady her horse, how they used to hold hers behind the barn when they were just kids. "You came back," she said softly. "I would have sooner if I knew." She looked away. "Tell me about Tommy and Tessa," he said. Her eyes lit up, just a little. "Tommy is 7. He is quiet, thinks too much, always has. He can read better than most grown men. Tessa is 5. She talks from sun up to sundown, loves to braid wildflowers into her hair." He smiled. "Sounds like someone I used to know." Margaret gave a soft laugh sudden, like she was not ready for it. She covered her mouth. I have not laughed in weeks. Then we will keep that going. She looked at him, really looked this time. They are with a family outside Fort Benton. I do not know where. The judge said they needed a proper home. Callum stood. Then we ride to Fort Benton. She stared at him. We. He leaned down, resting a hand on the table. You are not alone anymore. They left 2 days later. Callum fixed up the wagon with new wheels from town. Margaret packed what little she had, mostly dried bread, a few jars of preserves, and the only 2 dresses she owned. She braided her hair back and wore her boots for the first time in months. He helped her climb up onto the seat. She did not let go of his arm until they were miles out of town. The road to Fort Benton was rough, dusty trails and narrow passes. But they made camp each night and shared stories by the fire. Some nights she cried. He never said a word, just handed her his coat and sat beside her until she fell asleep. Other nights she asked about his life. I worked cattle in Wyoming for a while, he said. Then Idaho. Thought I would try to forget this place. Did you? No, she gave a quiet smile. Good. By the 3rd night she was laughing again. Real laughter, not just the soft kind. She laughed when Callum tripped over his bedroll. She laughed when a rabbit stole a piece of bread right from his boot. He watched her with quiet eyes. You are still in there, he said. She touched her chest, just above her heart. Feels like it is waking up. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Neither of them let go. By the time the river came into view, the land had flattened and the sun hung heavy behind a veil of thin clouds. Margaret sat with her hands wrapped around her knees in the wagon seat, her braid tucked into the collar of her coat. The wind carried the scent of wet grass and horses, and the wheels creaked in rhythm with each rise and fall of the trail. They passed a burned-out homestead late in the afternoon. The walls were blackened but still standing, a child's chair half buried in the weeds beside the porch. Margaret turned her face away as they passed. Callum said nothing, but he slowed the horses a little, the reins loose in his hands. They say it was lightning, she said finally, voice low. But I heard it was the neighbors. Said the man there had taken in a Metis widow and her boy. Folks decided he'd lost his mind. Callum's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the road. People do wicked things when they think they won't be made to answer. She didn't reply. Her fingers pressed into the fabric of her skirt, steady and deliberate. They camped near the riverbank that night. The grass was soft and silvered in moonlight, and water trickled low over smooth stones. Margaret laid her bedroll a little ways from the fire, the heat of the day still clinging to the earth beneath her. Callum sat cross-legged, sharpening his knife with quiet strokes. Sparks from the fire drifted upward into the dark like fireflies. I used to dream about this road, she said, staring into the flames. He paused the blade against the whetstone. What kind of dream? I'd be walking it, barefoot, carrying something I couldn't see. I'd walk and walk, but the road never ended. Just more sky, more dust. He set the knife aside. You think you're still in it? I don't know, she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. But I'm not walking anymore. That's something. The silence settled again, softer this time. Callum reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded scrap of canvas. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small leather-bound book, the edges worn smooth. I kept this, he said, from before I left. Margaret leaned forward, catching the glint of handwriting on the first page. Your mother's Bible? He nodded. She gave it to me before she passed. Said no matter where I went, I'd need something to hold to. Margaret reached out, hesitated, then took it. She turned the pages with a kind of reverence, her fingertips tracing the underlined verses. There's a pressed flower in here, she murmured. Blue columbine. You gave it to me the day before the train left. She didn't speak for a long moment. I waited 2 weeks at the creek after you left, she said. I'd go every morning. Thought if I stood in the water long enough, you'd ride back over the hill. I should have written. She closed the book and handed it back. You didn't have the words then. I have them now. Their eyes held, the firelight catching in theirs. She didn't look away. Then say them. He didn't hesitate. I was a coward. Not because I didn't love you, but because I did, and I didn't believe I could be the man you needed. I thought leaving would save you from disappointment. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I see now that leaving was the worst thing I could have done, he continued, and I'll spend every mile ahead trying to earn back what I lost. Margaret's breath came slow, even. She glanced toward the river, where frogs had begun to call from the reeds. I don't know if I believe in earning things anymore, she said, but I believe in time, and this time, I'm not waiting at the creek. She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, and walked toward the edge of the water. Callum let her go. He didn't follow. He knew the shape of silence when it was needed. She stood there a long time, arms wrapped around herself, watching the current. When she turned back, her face wasn't empty. It wasn't full either, but it was hers again. She walked back, settled beside him near the fire, and reached for the whetstone. Show me how, she said. He handed her the blade. Their fingers touched. She didn't pull away. Slow, he said, guiding her hand, like you're coaxing it awake. She nodded, watching the edge catch the light. The moon rose high, and the fire burned low. When they laid down that night, their bedrolls were closer than before. Not touching, but near enough to feel each other's breath. Neither said good night. They didn't need to. The Fort Benton Sheriff's Office stood just off the levee road. Its wooden siding sun bleached and cracked, the windows streaked with river dust. Callum tied the horses out front while Margaret stood beside the wagon, her fingers tightening on the edge of her shawl. She hadn't spoken since they'd crossed the ferry that morning, her eyes fixed on the town like she was walking through someone else's dream. Inside, the air held the sharp tang of tobacco and old paper. A man sat behind the desk, his beard trimmed close, a faint scar running from his temple to his jaw. He looked up as they entered, his gaze moving from Callum to Margaret and pausing. Morning, he said, voice flat. What business brings you? We're looking for records, Callum answered. Adoption placement. 2 children, Tommy and Tessa Tiller. Brought in by Judge Holloway late July. The sheriff leaned back slow, his chair groaning. You kin. I'm their mother, Margaret said, raising her eyes. Her voice steadied on the last word. He studied her a moment. I remember the case. Holloway ruled on it himself. Said the home was no place for raising young uns. Placed M north of town with the lanes. Do you know if they're safe? She asked. The sheriff scratched his beard. That family's quiet. Keep to themselves. But I've heard no complaints. I want to see them, she said. I won't cause trouble. I just want to see my children. He nodded, slow. That's not mine to block. But I'd ride careful. Lane's not a man fond of surprise. Outside, Margaret stood in the middle of the street for a long moment before turning to Callum. I don't know what I'll say. Then speak with your eyes first, he said. They'll know. They rode north under a sky stretched wide and pale. The land unfolded in slow swells of grass and cottonwood, the Missouri winding to their left, silver where the light touched it. The Lane homestead came into view at the top of a long rise painted white with a red barn and a line of wash drying in the wind. 2 children sat near the porch steps, their heads bent together. Margaret's breath caught. She didn't speak, didn't move, only watched. Tessa's taller, she whispered. Callum stopped the wagon a good distance off. You want me to come? She shook her head. No. If I go alone, maybe they'll listen. She stepped down and walked the rest of the way with her shoulders square and her hands open at her sides. The children looked up first. Tessa stood, uncertain. Tommy stayed seated, his face unreadable. A man stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed as Margaret approached, but he didn't reach for a rifle, just watched. I'm not here to take them, she said before he could speak. I just want to see them. I won't stay long. The man glanced to the children, then back. They know who you are? I hope so. He nodded once and turned back toward the barn without another word. Margaret knelt on the packed earth, her knees just inches from where Tommy sat. He stared at her, mouth tight. You didn't come. Her breath shook. I couldn't. They said I wasn't fit. Tessa stepped closer, her small hands twisting in her apron. You look tired. Margaret smiled faintly. I am. I've been trying to find the way back to you. Tommy looked down at the dirt. Mister. Lane doesn't yell. I'm glad, she said. You deserve peace. Tessa reached forward, touching the edge of her sleeve. Are you gonna stay? Margaret hesitated. Not today, but soon. I came with someone who's helping me. Tommy's eyes flicked past her, toward the wagon in the distance. Who? A friend, she said. Someone who remembers me before everything went quiet. He didn't answer, but his shoulders eased just enough to notice. She didn't ask for hugs, didn't beg. She stood and stepped back, letting silence do the rest. Back at the wagon, Callum waited with the reins loose in his hands. They're all right, she said, climbing up beside him. He didn't look at her. Did they know you? They wanted to. They rode south again as the light shifted golden around them. The wind had picked up, lifting dust in slow spirals across the road. Did I ever tell you about my uncle's orchard? She asked suddenly. Callum gave her a sidelong glance. No, it was near Miles City. He planted trees no one thought would grow in that soil. Apples mostly. They said he was wasting time, but he kept at it. Every spring, he'd tie strips of linen to the branches, just to see which ones the birds landed on first. What for? So he knew which ones to watch, which ones had life in them. Callum nodded. And did they ever bear fruit? She smiled, faint and real. They did. Took 8 years. He didn't speak again until they crested a low ridge. The land spread quiet beneath the sky. When you're ready, he said. We'll come back. I'll be ready soon, she said. They made camp beside a stand of cottonwoods. The fire was low, and the stars came out one by one, slow and certain. Margaret sat with her back to a tree, knees drawn to her chest. Callum watched her from across the fire, his elbow resting on one knee. Do you regret not marrying? She asked. It was the first time she'd spoken his name since they'd left. Callum didn't answer right away. I told myself I was waiting until I'd earned something. Land, maybe. A name. But I think I was just afraid I'd fail at it. Were you ever close? He shook his head. No one filled the space. She traced a line in the dirt beside her. My husband was never cruel, just tired of me. I think he saw something broken and didn't want to carry it anymore. Callum leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You weren't broken. You were surviving. She looked at him then. I'm still not whole. You don't have to be. Just willing. The fire cracked between them, sending a soft flare into the dark. Margaret stood and crossed the space slowly. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither moved. Will you stay? She asked. He didn't turn his head. As long as you'll have me. She rested her head lightly against his arm. Then stay. The stars wheeled overhead. The fire burned low, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without waking. By late September, the cottonwoods along the creek behind the farmhouse turned a brittle gold. The sky no longer carried the heat of summer. The wind had a bite to it now, brushing down from the mountains and threading through the seams of the house. Margaret stood in the root cellar, her hands dusted with flour and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. A half-filled sack of cornmeal sat at her feet, and the jars on the shelves clinked softly as she stepped past them. Upstairs, Callum was hammering a new hinge onto the back door, the rhythmic strikes measured and calm. They'd been back from Fort Benton a week. No one in town had said much, but the glances were no longer sharp. The grocer had offered her extra dried beans without charge. The schoolteacher had nodded when they passed on the road. "Margaret," Callum called from the kitchen, his voice low enough not to startle. "There's a man riding in, just one." She wiped her hands on her apron and climbed the narrow stairs, stepping into the kitchen where the morning light caught the dust in the air. Through the window, she saw the rider older, heavy-set, with a coat the color of rust and a satchel tied behind his saddle. Callum stood at the threshold, his posture neutral but alert. The man reined in and tipped his hat. "Name's Carter Lane," he said. "I believe you met my brother north of the river." Margaret stepped forward, her fingers curling slightly against her skirt. "We did." Carter dismounted with a grunt. "He asked me to ride down. Said the children've been quiet since you left. Not sad, just waiting." Callum stepped aside to let him pass the gate. "You came a long way." "I did," Carter said, glancing around the yard. "My wife and I agreed we'd like you to visit again. Longer this time. Let the little ones hear your voice more than once." Margaret's breath caught, but she held it steady. "They've been well." Carter nodded. "Tommy's read every book in our house twice. Tessa's taken to shadowing my wife like a second shadow. They're good children." She looked at Callum. He gave the slightest nod, his eyes holding hers with quiet certainty. "I'll come," she said. Carter smiled, the lines around his mouth deepening. "We'll expect you next week. Stay as long as you like." After he rode off, Margaret sat on the back step, elbows on her knees. Callum joined her, dropping to sit beside her in the yellowed grass. "I thought about them every hour," she said. "I didn't let myself believe I'd ever hear that invitation." Callum plucked a seed pod off the ground, rolling it between his fingers. "You earned it, not with pleading, just by being steady." She turned her face toward him. "Do you ever miss your family?" He nodded once. "My father died in a mining collapse when I was 16. My ma passed the year I left. After that, it was just drifting." "Did you ever want children?" He looked out across the pasture, where the fence leaned under the weight of age. "I used to think I wouldn't know how to raise them right, but I've seen what happens when someone just shows up and stays." She reached for his hand, and this time it wasn't hesitation, it was habit. His palm was rough and warm, and her fingers fit into the spaces like they'd always meant to. "You've stayed," she said. "I will." That night, Callum brought in 2 chairs from the barn and set them beneath the stars. He poured hot water into the tin basin while Margaret combed out her hair for the first time in weeks. They didn't speak much. The quiet between them was no longer heavy, it was full, like the hush of a room just before dawn. As she stepped barefoot onto the porch, her shawl around her shoulders, he looked up from the basin. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the orchard you told me about, the one your uncle planted." She sat beside him, tucking her feet beneath her. "What about it? You ever think about planting something here?" She looked toward the edge of the yard, where the ground sloped gently down to the creek. "There's space enough, and I've still got my grandmother's apple seeds in the cupboard. Then comes spring," he said. "We'll put them in the ground. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They may take years. He rested his chin lightly against her hair. I've got years. The moon rose slow and full above the ridge. Somewhere across the field, a nightbird called once, then fell quiet. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time since the children were taken, she slept without a single dream. The frost came early that year, creeping along the fence posts and curling the last of the garden leaves into brittle husks. Margaret stood at the edge of the pasture with her hands tucked into her shawl, watching the breath rise from the horses. She still woke early, often before the light, but now it wasn't out of habit or dread. The house had taken on a new rhythm, a steady one, built on small rituals and the quiet presence of another soul moving through the same space. Behind her, Callum was splitting kindling in the half-sun, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill. The sound of the axe rose and fell, not rushed, not idle. Margaret turned toward him, her footsteps soft over the frost-laced grass. "You'll wear through that blade before winter's out," she said. Callum looked up, brushing a sleeve across his brow. "Then I'll sharpen it again come spring." She tilted her head. "You always talk like the seasons are promises." "They are," he said. "If you wait long enough, they come back." That afternoon, she unpacked the wooden chest her uncle had left her after his passing. It had gathered dust in the loft for years, but now she brought it down to the front room. Inside were yellowed seed packets, a worn ledger, and a small tin of beeswax polish. She laid them out on the table, sorting through what was still good. Callum watched from the doorway, hands resting on his belt. "You planning to plant all those?" "Not all," she said. "Some are too far gone. But I thought we'd try the red astracans. They don't mind cold ground." "That ledger yours?" She thumbed through it. "His. He kept notes on every tree he ever grafted, even ones that failed." "Then I reckon we've got a guide." They spent the next week preparing the orchard plot. Callum dug the trenches while Margaret marked the rows with twine and stakes. They worked side by side without much talk, pausing only when the wind picked up strong enough to lift the loose soil and sting their cheeks. In the evenings, they came in with dirt under their nails and the smell of earth clinging to their clothes. One morning, a letter arrived from the Lanes. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table while Callum watched her face. She read it slowly, lips just moving. "They want to bring the children next week," she said, folding the paper carefully. "To stay for a few days." Callum nodded once. "Good. They said Tommy's been asking about the orchard." She looked up. "He wants to help plant." "Then he will." That night, Margaret lit a lantern and brought it out to the porch. She sat in the rocking chair with a quilt across her knees, the glow casting soft light along the rail. Callum joined her, carrying a tin of boiled peanuts and a small flask of cider. "I used to think this house was too quiet," she said. "And now it sounds like it's waiting for something." He leaned back, the wood creaking under his weight. "It's waiting for laughter, footsteps, someone asking for more bread. I don't know if they'll want to stay." "They don't have to decide yet," he said. "Let them feel it first. Let them see you as you are now. And if they choose to leave again, then we'll keep building. This place will still grow." She reached over and laid her hand on his. "You've never asked me." He looked at her, puzzled. "Asked what?" "If I'd be your wife." Callum sat still for a moment. The lantern light caught in the lines beside his eyes. "I didn't want to ask until you were sure you wanted anything again," he said. "Not just comfort or help, but this. I am sure." He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it gently. "Then marry me in the orchard, when the frost lifts. We'll stand between the rows and say the words with dirt on our boots." She smiled, eyes shining without tears. "I'd like that." The day the children arrived, the sky was soft with cloud cover. The leaves had all fallen, and the air smelled of chimney smoke and damp grass. Tommy stepped down from the wagon first, taller than before, his satchel slung over one shoulder. Tessa leapt down after him, her boots scuffing the earth. Margaret knelt as they crossed the yard. She didn't open her arms. She didn't need to. Tommy approached, gaze steady. "Is this where the trees will go?" She nodded. "We've got room for 12. Tessa reached up and touched the edge of her collar. "Can I sleep in the room with the blue curtains?" "If you want it," Margaret said. The children didn't go back to the wagon. That night, Callum carried Tommy's books upstairs and helped Tessa hang her coat on the back of the kitchen chair. Margaret baked molasses bread, and they ate by lamplight with the windows fogged from warmth. No one asked how long they'd stay. The days that followed settled into a rhythm full of hands at work and voices at dusk. Tommy helped Callum build frames for the saplings, learning the weight of a hammer. Tessa followed Margaret through the kitchen garden, pointing at dried stalks and asking what would grow there next. Late one evening, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret stood at the window, watching the last of the coals dim in the stove. "I had a dream last night," she said softly. "I was standing in the orchard, but the trees were full, blossoms everywhere. I could hear them laughing. All of them." Callum came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You were in it too," she said. He kissed her shoulder. "Then maybe it wasn't a dream. Maybe it's just later." Spring came slow, but it came. The frost melted from the soil, and the creek ran faster, fed by snowmelt in the high country. On the first clear day of April, Margaret stood in a pale green dress, her shawl pinned with a sprig of dried lavender. Callum wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, the same ones he'd bought in Helena all those years ago and never worn. They stood between the rows, the children on either side, and spoke their vows with the smell of turned earth beneath them. There was no preacher, just the sky and the trees and the promise made by hand and heart. Tessa scattered petals as they walked back to the house. Tommy led the way, carrying a basket of bread still warm from the oven. That night, they sat by the fire while the wind stirred the orchard. The children fell asleep on the rug, curled against each other like roots growing in the same soil. Callum took Margaret's hand and pressed it to his chest. "We've made something," he said. She leaned into him, resting her head there. "It will last." Outside, the trees stood bare but ready. And inside, the house was full.